we get to talk about power. Um, and so I think the framing for this one, oh, yay.
Yeah, right on cue.
Oh, perfect, Sasha. I'm so glad you're here. This is one of those conversations deliciously made for you. It's like served up on a platter for thee, Sasha. So what this conversation is really focused in on is how do we equip, what can private investors do? So we're sort of focused here. We've gone all over the map, and I was just working with Tia to really fine tune the public equities conversation tomorrow morning, but really thinking in this case, we're talking about private investors who are working through a whole investment process, right? So not just one moment here or there, but thinking about how private investors can use their power to advocate, push for financing the reduction of gender-based violence, with a little bit of a goal to get to a lot of what we're going to be focused on in October is really taking some of the conversations from here combined with 3 years of work, thinking about what's a roadmap. Like if you're a private investor, what are the things that you can do to sort of move people along this path? And so maybe just a quick round of individually, where do you come into this conversation? Because I know, Teresa, this is a lot of your day-to-day work to equip investors to go into those conversations and use their power. Maybe just a quick once round about how we come into these conversations, since I called you out, Teresa.
I was like, I'll go first since I got called out. And I just to echo what she says is that a lot of the work that I do is working with ultra high net worth individuals and families, as well as large foundations and endowments on moving more and more of their capital into alignment with whatever change they want to see in the world. And a lot of the work that I specialize in particularly is inside of private markets. That's anywhere along kind of a risk return dynamic and expression, but a lot of it mostly has been focused within what I call more of a catalytic space, where we're trying to advance various different social and economic outcomes above and beyond a return, and we're really dissecting and trying to influence what is an appropriate return in order for that response and not an extractive one. And so that's where I come into a lot of this conversation.
I might just say too, Joy, that my background was similar in working with ultra high net worth family offices. I've been out of that space now for a couple of years, but my where I was sitting was probably more trying to use my position to influence people to think more along that line, which is probably a harder place to come from, because I had clients who were, I would say, traditional investors that used the returns that they made from their traditional investments to towards philanthropy, or they may dabble with something impactful on the side. Mm-hmm. But what I was looking to do was find the tools and frameworks, and to showcase ways, or I suppose exactly as you said, draw a roadmap for how they could be more impactful. And that's what I want to do in my next career step as well. So very interested to hear people's thoughts today.
Julia, want to build on that since you're partners in crime on this?
So that's right. So we are partners in crime in trying to create some roadmaps in Australia for Australian investors, and looking at what that might be, and some Australian, hopefully Australian targets as well. Except that Vicky says it much better, so I don't know that I need to add much more, except to also add to that, I think from my background has been working in, apart from a bit in advisory, is really in governance and corporations. So I have a very live example at the moment where I'm a board member that's trying to move the way that, or influence the way $15 billion of capital is being invested. And I guess where we are in the development of the Australian market, where we have a lot of pension equivalent of pension funds using ESG screens, the market is not developed in relation to gender, and of course even less in relation to looking at GBV. So for Vicky and I, we have a number of areas we're hoping to agitate, contribute and influence, and that includes the area for private investors and the questions they can start to ask, and the way forward that they might be able to, the way forward that they can take.
Cool. Nina? Anybody else you want to jump in, Nina, or no?
I'm a listener and a learner. Very impressive.
Well, you also have been on this path of shaping your own. I mean, I think that's actually the experience that you've had in shaping your family's foundation is quite relevant to thinking about how you assessed their readiness and the patients around that.
No question.
Cool.
Yeah, I think gender-based violence is sort of a whole nother level. So I'm just getting everyone to see ESG as important, and like beginning to acknowledge that, yes, we need to ask our investment advisors what the impact and how they're assessing these funds. And so now I have to add this other level to the questions. And I guess the question that I would have for you all on this call in terms of the roadmap, what I was thinking as I was listening was an example, Joy, you gave years ago at a conference about bonds on the Dallas airport and sexual trafficking, and shouldn't the airport include the reduction of sexual trafficking through the highest trafficked airport in the country as part of the bond rating. But it's specific examples like that that I think give someone like me the power to ask, because otherwise they're blank. They're like, oh, why is this, like I need that kind of specific linkage to present to the people I'm asking the question of, by way of example, this or that. So that would help me in the roadmap.
I think that's so valuable, Nina. Thank you for sharing that, because that was my experience as well, is that especially at the broader and deeper the family goes, there's always going to be conflict within there as to who values what and who has the say, I suppose, without causing family friction. And I think, again, we go back to the messaging and communicating and how you have a voice at the table, which I think is still part of assisting family members to have that voice. I think would be very valuable as well.
Sasha?
Oh boy, I was hoping you wouldn't ask. I don't really know. I'm trying to, so I sit a little bit in two places. One as a philanthropic advisor and one as a funder with a family foundation. And so on the one side of this question, it's cleaning up my own investments to align with my own values, which has been such a difficult and reflective process, ongoing and long. I am not the sole provider of the wealth that we have, nor am I the sole decider, but you have to, how do you work in that way and then, have your values align? Way harder than it sounds. However, on the advisory side, it's been such an incredible practice for me to be able to talk to other people about that particular way of thinking. And I think part of what I have thought about in coming into this space is that I have a responsibility for others in the world to flourish. And because of that, I want to be able to ask myself and others to answer particular questions that might pull back some discomfort if we pull back the kimono, but we can, if we narrow the gap on our values, what we say are our values and what we actually do by that reflection, then we are going to exhibit deep and resilient leadership in our own personal lives and in our professional lives. So I feel that some of my work is do what I say, not what I do, and also do what I do, and trying to understand that it's not a yes or no. We hold these values and we hold the tension of the values in our lives. And to that end, I will try to wrap this up really quickly. Finance seems to have a lot of these bottom line hashtag sort of things that we can say, such like, let's hit them in the pocketbook, hit them where it hurts. It's always about the bottom line, shareholders, right? And when you're asking people to look at a return as something more than a number, which is that you actually want communities, you want society to flourish and have value, as opposed to looking at rates of return, that puts gender-based violence in a different sort of mindset. So if I can get folks who are interested in impact investing or aligning all their investments, it's really asking these types of questions. One, are you able to tolerate the tensions that arise when we pull back the kimono? And number two, it's going to be so valuable to you when we do. And number two, I wish to these issues and questions that are arising, we had those sort of bottom line things that would bring these solutions. At the same time, I thrive on all this intellectual masturbation that we're doing in this session. I love it. So I talked a lot there, but I'm going to go off.
All great, all great. Mindy, I'm wondering, where you want to come into this conversation?
I'm glad you let me in, Joy. You're probably like, why is Mindy here? So I'm not associated with a family office, or I'm not an investor myself. So I'm coming at this from a very different perspective. I'm a expert on working on violence against women and girls. So I've been doing it for over 20 years, mostly in the conflict and disaster space. I run an organization called Voice that's fairly new, and I am increasingly finding myself meeting family office people and investors who actually want to understand how they could invest and how they could contribute. Sometimes it's actually one person in a family office who's trying to, usually a woman, who's trying to shift the way the family office is moving and to guide her brothers, for example, into investing in violence against women and girls. Sometimes it's just helping them explore, like, how, if they wanted to move into the space, how could they do that? How could they get the information that they would need to be well informed about doing that, and investing in programs that are successful and tested and things like that. So I'm really listening like Nina. I'm already like really excited about what you all have said, but I think that I sort of feel like this is one of those translation conversations too, Joy, in a sense, where we need all of us to be part of the kind of the conversation to talk about what the possibilities are.
Yeah. Christina, you want to talk a little about how you're coming into this conversation?
I think just in terms of, Joy mentioned the roadmap, but I'm thinking also in terms of the ecosystem and where different players fall within that roadmap, and just thinking like for asset holders, what, how do they, I don't know, what is the framing that works in different contexts with people that you're trying to influence? What are the standards and how do you apply different standards in different contexts so you can be adaptive to different kinds of gender-based violence, different geographic regions, again, different asset classes and audiences, but also united as one, so that we're actually moving something and using that influence collectively. And then what are the tools that can enable that to happen and bring it all together?
Yeah, well, that was more simply said than how it was running through in my head, Christina, just because I think so much of what we've been working on for the last couple of years is really resonant in this conversation from a couple angles. But within the gender-based violence work, we really started by thinking about whose power did we need to borrow to be able to even get this on the map, right? So the initial letter of intent campaign was a very intentional, nobody's going to listen to us talk about gender-based violence until we have a big ass number, Sasha, right? That we can say seven, so we walked around saying, we're going to have $1 trillion of intent of people who want to invest to make a difference on gender-based violence. And I don't want to go too far into this, but we've learned a lot from that letter of intent campaign and its strengths and its limitations. The biggest limitation we hit was exactly the theme of this conference of moving from intent to action. They could sign on, but if we didn't give them something to do, then it was meaningful to us, but not to them. And it was meaningful to us because we could borrow their power to sort of get a couple years of a running start on what can we actually then do. So with some of that in mind, I'm going to throw out 3 questions here. And because this is Convergence, we can, of course, end up talking about something completely different. I'm always game to go back to chicken parm if anybody wants to, but I think we've exhausted that topic. But sort of 3 questions here. One is, and in this case, really focusing on individual investors. Teresa, it doesn't have to be on individual investors in private investments. Maybe we want to go there. There might be different kinds of power that you have within that. But the first is, when do individual investors have the most power and what power do they have? Right, so actually, Mendy, as I was seeing you come on this call, I was like, oh, cool, she's good at a power analysis, right? Because at some point, part of what we have to figure out is, when do individual investors have the most power? What power do they have to be able to influence? What tools are needed to support investors to be able to use their power? Right, so what are the moments where Molly Gachman of Stardust Foundation always wants 10 questions. What can I ask? What can I ask? What should I ask for? Right, there's a kind of, what are the tools that particularly private investors need when they're in that moment somewhere along an investment process where they could use their power? And then this third one is something that Siri Rankin and I started thinking about a year ago, which is, how do you determine whether or not you're actually using all of your power or not? So how do you know if in that moment, because it's an interesting piece. Siri and I have been working on sort of building a set of investors who are actively willing to use their power to disrupt systems of power. And one of the things we kept sort of running up against is, it's really easy to measure, did you move your capital? It's less easy to measure, did you use your power? Partly because it's so contextual in terms of, well, in that setting, I didn't have enough power, or I'd have enough power if I had better data, or in these different circumstances. So thinking a little bit about, how do you assess, how do you give guidance to an individual? And so let's just assume here, we're talking about people who want to use their power, right? Whoever they are, right? That they are actively wanting to use their power to make a difference, as opposed to don't care. But obviously, anybody who's using their power often uses their power to convince other people who have power to do things, because nobody acts alone, right? So it does sit in the context of convincing. But it is even, just a quick example, then I'll shut up. But there's a partner that we have in Southeast Asia, and their job is to sort of implement a gender lens investing program. And very often they come back to us and said, well, we would love to do gender in this context, but our partner's really not ready. It's like, okay. How did you assess that? Well, we just we're not in a position to really push. And it's been an interesting conversation to come up with metrics that say, how would you analyze whether or not you actually had the power to push? Because one of the things we're continuing to work on as a kind of theory within Criterion is, and you saw this in the sort of how to build a portfolio, most people would say how to build a portfolio is you move your capital to products. For us, we're saying more and more, you use your voice and your power to actually influence what's happening around you, and then you can move capital later. But if you wait for the products to be built, dumb products will be built sometimes, not all the time, but really often. So anyway, long dissertation. So Sasha, you sounded like super short compared to me, and I didn't even think you were long at all. But anyway, I was just long. So anyway, 3 questions on the table. And general agreement that this is a conversation worth having. Any edits you want to have to these questions? Teresa, what you thinking?
Oh, a lot. So I guess in the, it's a weird dynamic that I'm in, because as you're sitting here talking about all the different places where one has power and not, this isn't my money, right? And so what I'm doing is I'm working in partnership with my clients to understand, shepherd that money in a way that aligns well with like that theory of change in their value system that they want to see have happen, guide them and educate them about some of the elements that like to help expand upon what that theory of change is, and like how, that's an influence, right? That's a power that I could bring into that conversation, is to help them understand, like, it's more than just gender lens. It's more than just board seats. Don't count noses. Let's think about impact. And like, what are all of those kind of, what are the translational aspects of that? And that's a piece of power. But at the end of the day, like, I can appreciate where, like what you just said, where somebody's like, well, I'm not sure they're ready yet. Like in some cases, like, I don't, it's not my money. Right. And so I have to try to manage through some of that. But I would say that like maybe education, and then where my power comes in is whenever I do know that like, okay, now I've created this demand from the people that I work with and more generally across my firm, then I can push hard within my firm and within our research functions about how we're doing it and what we're looking for, and that we should be spending more money and resources in this area. And then I can also use that influence to push the end solutions and products about what they're actually doing and how the terms are structured and things like that. That I can kind of weave in the conversation that we had. I think Vicki, you were on it, and Julia, I know you were on it, but we were talking about moving, like changing the impact rather than at the end or as an outcome, like moving it all the way to the beginning and how we actually underwrite the investment. And that was really inspiring, because there's some things that we've been working on that are moving in that way. And to me, like that kind of comes into that equation too, right? Don't tell me what you're going to do later on. Actually, let's make sure that the terms right now cannot allow for anything else. And I think that's an interesting kind of dynamic. Sorry, that's all over the place, but that was all the things that I'm thinking of when you're talking about this.
Any other sort of initial reactions to these questions? For this conversation? Maybe before we dive in, since this seems like a good pause to say, hands off your computers just for a second. And because this is sort of a good moment to remind ourselves that we have power and that we're not alone. So we pause in the middle of the session for an acknowledgement. Take hold of your own hand, which is hard for Sasha because you've got it in a brace. Goodness gracious me. Take hold of your own hands. We're not alone. We have power in our hands. This is not a light topic. And in this conversation, we'll intellectualize and abstract a set of very real experiences. These discussions may trigger a wide range of emotions. In this room, statistically, are many survivors of gender-based violence. And we all participate in political, social, cultural, and economic systems that give permission for and facilitate violence. a moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this precise moment, somewhere, to someone. Now reverse your hands and notice the difference. We come together to create new possibilities and hopefully to uncover new kinds of power to address the epidemic of violence in our world and connect it in new ways. We can do even more. So let us begin.
Joy, just to jump in, I did actually think of another thing that, and I don't understand, maybe Mindy can help understand what I'm actually saying. So I think you can actually also pass your power to other people. Maybe that's called empowerment. But I think that sometimes we in using our power, we decide what the other party needs to know. And of course, we try to find the best frame and yeah, what I think Christina said was really great, and look forward to all of that. And I think that you can, through empowering other people, amplify your power and provide that leverage. So part of that is, you know, if we're in a discussion where we're talking to an investor about maybe the type of issues they want to think about, I think we should also consider to pass on the power regarding and unpack basic theories of change regarding gender-based violence. And I understand that sometimes there is reticence in doing that, but I think that is also very powerful, and it does create more power with the investor themselves. So maybe it's empowerment, maybe it's something else, but I think it's worth considering that there is a lot of value in doing that. And so, and thus, what does that bring us to? It is important to be able to find the right way to articulate that theory of change.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, Julia. I mean, I think that that's one of the many things that brings me to this conversation, right? Because I mean, I need to mobilize money for the work that we do, but that's only a small piece of it, right? If I do my job well, then I am in conversation where I am helping others think about where they fit in and how can I explain that theory of change in a way that will help them see themselves in it and how it relates to their lives and to their portfolios, right? Like, I think it's really that's as important to me as everything else related to what we're doing, right? Because I truly believe that if we can get people to connect, then that is the way that I can use my place of privilege, which is I do have a place of privilege, right? And I do have my power from my experience and my expertise, and I need to figure out how to use that with investors to help bring them on board. But it's a tricky thing, right? It's tricky to get them also to link that to their values, like you're all saying, right? How do you get them to see how that is linked to their personal values, right? And help them, and motivates them.
I think one of the things just building on this that I keep being just shocked as hell about is so much of impact investing, innovative finance is focused on dollars moved, right? That is the mode of success, right? We move dollars to this thing. And I think, as all of us on this call know, moving dollars to a thing doesn't mean that you got the impact that you wanted, or it got structured in the way that it needed to be, or that it even is necessarily good for that entrepreneur, right? We've been doing these power analyses in particular in the Pacific Islands, and just realizing that, like, sort of standard impact processes have such a significant power imbalance that they often, you know, I don't know, just sort of, if I think we all on this call sort of generally agree that simply putting somebody in debt or taking a piece of their company is not always a good thing unless you do it in a way that's actually structured well and addresses those pieces. So anyway, my thought on this is maybe what often people are asking for from us, right? So, and this is us being Criterion, right? They're sort of saying, give me the tools to convince somebody to move money to it. Tell me where you want me to invest, and then give me the tools give me the tools that will convince them to move the capital. And I'm not suggesting that moving capital's not a bad thing, but we have this particular problem with gender-based violence, which is there aren't products. And a lot of this is about shaping the products that already exist, not just move. So it really, there's something about this gender-based violence work that requires that people influence as much as invest. And so within that, thinking back to this first question about where are the places that have, where are the places you sort of along the process where a private investor could influence how the investment is happening. And maybe normally what a roadmap would be is what does it take to build the product so that people can move money? I think we have a different problem here. And I think we have this problem in gender lens and investing in general, which is the products that got built were a bunch of things about women on boards and women-led businesses. So we need to influence them and ask for different things as much as say the clever finance people have figured things out and we just need to move capital to them. So thinking of maybe starting with that, how would you analyze, there's just something about how do you actually analyze what power you have at different moments to influence? So where are those points where a private investor could use their power effectively? Where are those moments of leverage? It's a hard question. We can think for a while.
I'm just thinking really like activism and movement, which is, I suppose where I get to is that the people that actually do hold the capital or the power, because holding the capital does give you the power, are not, perhaps their values or motivations are not best aligned to take this work forward.
But let's say that we have, because I know we do, about 60 people who signed this letter of intent who said they're willing to use their power to affect things, right? So even just for those 60 people, Vicki, right? Because I realize there might be, you might be absolutely right? This goes back to Mendy's point of like, maybe it's Mendy who has the most important power here and it's not about the wealth holders.
I hope I'm. Yeah, so the 60 people that have the, and this is probably a good question to ask, having Criterion, having gathered those letters of intent over that time, what do you think, what do you think was their motivation to?
I think it's a genuine concern in gender-based violence and often a lack of conviction in what's currently happening in gender lens investing, a desire to do more.
And the only thing, sorry, say Julie.
You go, Vicky. Sorry, I'm going to throw a spanner in the works here, but please keep going with that train of thought. I'm wondering how deep their where the depth of their motivation comes from, whether it be like, for example, I would say I could probably articulate where my motivation came from, which would be you know, a sense of fairness, just discussed with the whole fact that in this world that these imbalances happen, and I just wonder where the intent is the intent always from a place of fairness and good? Is the intent, is there any ego involved in any of the intent? Is there any desire to make money, the intent?
I suppose I'm just throwing it out there because I feel I'm in a safe place to talk about these things.
Yeah, it's a solid question. I think where I feel the most pressure, guilt, what keeps me up at night is, well, Molly Gutman, honestly, right? Here's somebody who has a significant amount of wealth. Her whole philanthropy and life is focused on ending violence. Systemic inequities, and she's fully on board and from the right place. And I think maybe it's just that I have the voice of the people who say, and then what do you want me to do? Right? So for me, it's the roadmap for the person who's bought in. And I think you're right, Vicki. Maybe there are definitely, we've tried to categorize them in different ways of how they've entered in. But there are a solid set of people. There are a lot of people for whom gender-based violence is their philanthropic cause, and they don't know how to translate it to investments, and they would if they could, but they don't know how to get started there. And so they say, well, just package it all for me and hand it to me. I'm like, come on, you work on gender-based violence. We don't just package it all together and hand it to you. It's a complicated issue, right? And so we've been inviting them into a conversation, not just about here's the packaged thing that you can ask your family to invest in, but how to enter into a different process of using your power. So I'm thinking about people like Carrie Rankin, right? Like she's on this journey, or what's her face? Carol Schwartz, right? Like folks for whom this is a real issue, but they don't know, they don't have a roadmap. So I think I might, and I've just got this set of people who I feel like I carry around, and we haven't done enough to say, here's your roadmap. And maybe it's their responsibility, but again, they're ready. What can we ask them to do?
Can I just sort of validate or reflect on that really quickly, if I can keep a clear thought in my head? Sorry, I had surgery and I'm still like addled from the anesthesia, but
Goodness.
So I totally understand what I think you said her name is, Molly. I don't know her, because when you're talking about finance, everything is packaged, right? That's what I was sort of trying to, we don't sit around asking the question, what is the, let's go do a road show for gender-based violence. Let's go out and, what are the products that we can do to, create to eradicate violence, against women? Not only that, but investments were created around, and I might get a lot of pushback on this, but I'm okay with that, is investments were created, opportunities, vehicles, whatever they are, were created around climate change. There's none really created around climate justice or women's rights. So, you have to have the majority of people buy into, yes, across divides, we have a climate change problem, severe. But people are not running around going, we have a gender-based violence problem. We have a child abuse problem. I'm not trying to diminish what you're doing, Joy. I'm just trying to say that I know from my own personal experience, and I've talked to Suzanne the same way, and she's been doing this for years, is trying to untangle your own wealth. And it's really hard because people don't have this package. Now, as a philanthropist and an advisor, I love the fact that these problems are tough, but I totally understand that laziness, as Suzanne Beagle says, where investors are very lazy in wanting to have these packages because it's quick, we get a return, which is so crazy when in fact they're funds that go on for 25 years. I don't know, but anyway, I digress. So I'm just saying, I think that, again, it's this sort of vicious cycle of, do we adapt that language, or do they have to meet us where we're at? It's kind of offensive to say, oh, is there some product that you can invest in that will you know, help women with gender-based violence when you've been yourself, let's say, somebody who's been abused. And I do want to just say, in that way, the word power, you know, I think, especially where I come from in gender politics, gender justice, and so on, it's like a bad thing. A lot of this power is really good. I mean, we work with clients all the time. You've done this, Joy, in facilitation, where you put up a paper and you say, okay, tell me about power, and people automatically negative, 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 unless you're like a hedge fund guy or something, then you get all this great, but power is good. And I in some ways, right, we have, and I spend so much time trying to diminish power with people and, you know, what we do. So I do think there's a very personal relationship around the word power. And I know that when I've talked to people and sort of diminished the guilt and the shame around power, then we can own more of our own power. You know, one other thing I wanted to ask you, Joy, quickly, because I don't know what, what process metrics for an investor. All I can think of is ROI, you know, like what else do I want to see is, you know, I've seen Trillium, you know, Matt Patsky has used shareholder advocacy to incredible success. Is that something to consider?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think absolutely. And
we can get investors to know that their power is what their power is, right? Like, what does it feel like to know? So I know that I have a lot of power. I might not know exactly where it can be used and leveraged and deployed, but I'm going to walk into a situation and go, yep, somewhere here I've got some power, and I'm going to figure that out.
yeah. And I'm just building on a point you made before about everything is packaged. And so I want to say really clearly, we're on a both and, like, absolutely, we need to get a bunch of packaged stuff and get it out there and give people simple things that they can start doing. Totally on top of that, like, absolutely, yes. But there was something the way you said that, Sasha, that just made me think about a radiator that we had when I was a little kid. And we put this nice box over it. And then when you took the box off, you actually, like, if you were around the box, it was like this nice seat, and you could sort of, but you took the box off, it was like this gnarly, like, paint chipping off this radiator. So I sort of feel like one thing we need to keep doing, and I've learned so much from Catherine Collins about this, is finance has an instinct to package things. That is what it does. It is not the best of what it does, right? In that packaging, a lot of the underlying value gets misaligned, it gets less transparent, and all of this does let you buy things. And I know there's a good side to the packaging, but packaging is not, the package is not the investment. And so I think part of what, you know, I guess this is sort of what Criterion does in this demystifying stuff, but that image, Sasha, that I'll take away from this is, how do you rip off the packaging so that people who are buying a package can see what's inside of it, and then be able to say, you know, like, I don't like buying bags of apples when I don't know if all of the apples are good. Like, let's buy, I'm sorry, the metaphors here just rolling off, but how do we strip off the packaging and sort of see how it works underneath it? Teresa, did you want to jump in, or Juliet?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that kind of kept coming up for me, like, you know, not only are the packages, I guess they create convenience, but they also, like, belie transparency, right? And then finance is I love finance because it can be wielded for good, but it can also, like, fall to the dark side, and does frequently. And the challenge is that a lot of those packages that create convenience, they also massively create disparity within communities, and they're, you know, incredibly disruptive. And so those, since we're in the context of talking about private markets, this is the area where you have the most influence to be able to reshape those systems, and, like, how money flows through those different packages, create new packages, right? That's where in the influence and the power of investors that are looking at this in this way. And I love that you mentioned that, Sasha, the notice of the global climate change. There's been other conversations where, and I'm sorry, Joy, to keep pounding the drum on this, around that future conversation, right? Like to show that future picture, to like get that movie out there, get that, you know, book out there, whatever that is, that reflects that. But, you know, we need that, because those then, you know, it allows people to get into that creative headspace where they're like, oh, I don't have to use these same tools. I can create new tools, and I can influence what those tools look like, and I can influence how those returns and those terms are set up. And, you know, we keep talking about power, but I think that, you know, what makes me really excited about this moment, and I'd be curious to see what Minnie's reflections are on this, but what I continue to see more and more, particularly within gender and racial equity moments, is that those that are really truly seeking capital are also very picky about where it's coming from, and that they're exercising their power back into saying, like, I know you've got the money. I know I probably need that money, but I ain't going to get it from you. And I'm going to exercise my power back into this moment, because I want to stay true to my mission. And I'm seeing investors do the same thing. And I think that's a like goosebump catalytic moment where you're like, let's put the power back into the hands of the folks that really know how to make that change happen. And that's showing up in investments and in terms. And I think it's showing up in philanthropy, how distributed power, and like how that's happening within a lot of these systems. And I think that's really, I think it's a cool time to start reshaping how finance flows through these systems.
It's so great to hear these stories as well. And how do we amplify those stories? Because those moments of power that might be happening in a one-on-one meeting, for example, if that was something that was more widely known, then that would empower more people. To Julia's other point, you're then handing that power on.
And I think, just to build on that, and my spanner was that not everybody wants to use the power they have. So maybe it's, Sasha said, that they have some guilt or something from using the power or the capital they have. So I think we need to be aware of that. I mean, for Vicky and I, certainly, I think if we had loads more money, we'd be using it, but instead we're going to go and influence other people to use their capital more effectively.
You guys are incredibly wily with your power, I will just say.
And
that's putting power to deep purpose. That's brilliant. People I work with are so ashamed of their money they have, especially women, right? So
I think that's it's a really interesting point, and we need to not just assume when we're in a conversation that somebody's going to feel really personally easy about doing that. Of course, one day we'll have a fund, and a gender-based violence fund in Australia, and everything will be hopefully easier where we can direct people. But until that amazing day, we have to try and influence other people. So I think and this is really building on actually Vicky's original point, is what are people's intent? So sometimes we have to be, and I think financial advisors have to be also part psychologists in the way that they speak to private investors, and that is partly I guess for Criterion in providing the tools. They are also not just trying to understand frames and to help provide information about putting in place process metrics, but also how we try to get people to actually use the power that they have. And I guess the last thing regarding the packaging question, I think, and it's a great question. Maybe sometimes for some people, transparency is not everything they want. For some other investors, it is. So we have to take that into account as well. So packaging something up around gender-based violence that really speaks to the incidence and the impact of gender-based violence and saying just as much as I've said is maybe all that's required, but for other investors, maybe it's not. So your classic horses for courses.
So I'm having this like small brain exploding, but go ahead, Mandy, you first.
Well, I just, this is so interesting. I love this conversation. I mean, and Teresa, to that point of like, God, it is so hard to, especially as an emerging organization, to say no to that money, right? It's so hard. And like, we've all been around the room where you like, I'll use a recent experience where a family office came to us to talk about how they want to fund in this space, but it's like the only person that spoke was the man around a team of a family of women, right? And the only thing that they were really interested in, the couple of men that were in the room, including the one that really spoke, was when we started talking about like what got pulled them in was like, oh, let's talk about perpetrator violence and men's violence against women. And then they're like, oh, interesting. But I wanted to say, what do the rest of the women think around that? What do you all think? What would you be interested in investing in as a woman who's part of this family office, right? So it's like, it's really interesting. Or I have another family, a friend who now is trying to pivot her family office, and she comes to me for advice on how she's being gaslighted by her brothers in the process, and how every investment that she wants to make is scrutinized, criticized in a completely different way than every other investment that they choose, right? So that's where I'm like, oh, that's the money I want to say no to, because I want to turn that into a learning moment, and I want to turn that into a reflection process. But I also don't want to have to be the one, because I stand to lose a lot by being the one that says no to the money. If I could have other people who would also help make that case and share the importance of us like being partnering and helping them also go through a process of transformation. So eventually all of their investments might be supportive. It'd be supportive of the women who are part of that family office. I'd have greater confidence that they actually are aligned with what we're aiming to do. I would trust them more. I would feel like I could show up more openly with them, and it would become a more transformative partnership and conversation, right? But it's really tricky to be the one that has to say no, right? When you're the one that is also trying to mobilize resources to keep your programming that's alive, right? So if there's also a way we could partner on that and to share those examples of saying no, or protecting the people that do say no, but to get the message out about why. I mean, I just think there may be some other ways we could kind of push people a little bit.
So that was, it's just the sort of small exploding things that are going up in my brain right now are building on that point exactly, Mandy, about so Teresa, you named sort of, and we can all talk to this, sort of the importance of packaging in investment vehicles, does all kinds of things, including allow a bunch of people to come together in the same investment and coordinate their actions, right? Like you pool investment capital in a package and everybody knows that it's the same thing, and then it's got power, but it's got all kinds of things in it. So what I started thinking about is, what if what we need to be doing is packaging the actions in the same way, Sasha, that you just said shareholder advocacy has been, right? What shareholder advocacy has done is packaged what provided like a supportive branded permission to walk in and vote your proxy on a set of things that people didn't used to vote their proxies on, but now it's a thing that people have permission to do. And I think the empathy that I definitely have, but I think I forget sometimes, is each of those moments when somebody is challenging a system of power by asking a question, right? Or pushing to say, I want to see more here. Every time that happens, there's a risk, right? Especially for the people who, there's a risk for everybody. There's more risk for some people than others, Mandy, to your point, right? So maybe what we need to be doing is kind of packaging the processes so that, I'm not gonna say this clearly, but so that there's more people taking similar actions, so there's more permission to do that. And it's not just the action of moving capital. It's the action of, the very simplest one that we had was everybody asked the same question in a given month of their advisors to say, have you factored in a future picture of gender-based violence, or have you factored in political risk and how it, women, peace, and security? And if everybody asked that question in the same month, at least in a US market, I can imagine the same thing as Australia, right? The fund managers' brains would, like, the advisors would be like, oh my gosh, everybody's asking this question. But like, how do we think about other things besides just shareholder activism that can kind of be packaged as an action?
As you're sitting here talking about this, I'm going to jump in because like two things come to my mind. One, like I have to keep saying that, like, beating this horse, like I think shareholder activism is incredibly important. I think it's going to be incredibly hard, particularly in the States with the new SEC legislation. So they're trying to take away these tools. So we need to get back into more policy action and lobbying to go back to these big people and use the power in that way. And maybe by asking these questions and having more and more people come at that table, whether that's around GBV or not, like everything, right? We deserve more power as shareholders, la, 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 la. Let us go back to the rules that we used to have. So that around shareholder activism. But the other thing, as you're sitting here talking about it, I'm like, oh my gosh, it kind of reminds me of what operational due diligence looked like for post-Madoff, right? Like post-Madoff, all of us that worked in funds, like as particularly alternative investments, there was a huge amount of, obviously a ton of learning that happened in that, but it also completely changed the way that hedge funds are ran and private funds are ran. And there is a whole new set of standards that investors required. And it, unfortunately, like it required, that many people to lose a whole lot of money with a crook in order to really catalyze that. Hopefully we can do something different and that future picture brings that to the light. But like having a whole series of like, these are standards that we require as investors deploying capital in this way. And so can we provide that? It's the toolkit, right? You're talking about a roadmap or like, what is the toolkit? But like, there's like a whole, there's like libraries of ways that you go through operational due diligence now as standards for how we deploy capital that way. These are the things that you must look for.
Yeah.
Just kind of, I don't know if that resonates with anybody at all in terms of like operational due diligence. And I got a little.
What I love about it is it's an example of what the Madoff stuff is about, is not just looking at the underlying investments, but looking at how the investment shop is run. And so part of the reason we've been pushing on process metrics is it's about fixing the capital, not fixing the company, right? That's sort of how do we stop saying that, well, we just need to fix all these companies so they become investable? How about we actually design capital that's useful to communities? That'd be a whole different idea. Without sacrificing returns, like there's just stupid stuff that ends up in investments that doesn't need to be there for the return reasons. But we do it because it gives us more power, it gives us more control as investors. And anyway, so I think, how do you disrupt those pieces within it? Julie, did you want to throw something in? Or Christina, you were off mute a while ago. Did you want to?
I'm going to take it in a different direction, but I was just going to name examples of some of the shareholder advocacy that was put forth around Me Too and sexual harassment that were successful in different US companies. SEIU led a lot of that advocacy, just sort of standardizing what are we asking for and getting that put forth.
And did they win?
I think they did in a lot of cases.
Well, I think shareholder advocacy is amazing. I just think it's not the only tool that we can use to shape how people do things. That's back to your point, Teresa. If shareholder advocacy is under threat, we need 18 tools, not just one. Oh, that's a cute kid. Huh. All of our families are wondering, and my husband's been wondering and bringing me dinner, so sorry for the disruptions here. Anyway.
Yeah, it's only like within the last week the SEC ruled out new rules. So there's definitely, I'm 100%, there's a ton of great work that's been done because of advocacy. They're just trying really hard to make it a lot harder for people to do it.
Julia, can you say this note out loud? I'm trying to process it and listen at the same time. I sort of feel like, yeah.
Okay, so this is just speaking to the process metrics issue. So we've heard Teresa's talking about shareholder advocacy. So it's a big part of how pension managers, fund managers work in Australia. So in Australia, you're going to have a large amount of money invested in domestic investments. And so if you're engaged in active stewardship for your ESG screen, or how you work with your fund manager to improve the way to monitor how social inequality is going in their company for whichever reason, that's fine. You can go and have a domestic based conversation, but then for the rest of it, it goes through how you manage your external manager. And then a large amount of that activism actually gets translated through shareholder, through proxy, the proxy process. So of course, that's not as transparent to an individual investor as it could be. So I think that certainly when you're looking at the percentage of fund managers that you have as external managers that are female, diverse, and all the rest of it is an important process metric. And I guess I'm just thinking through this and what Therese has actually just said, and thinking, well, we probably need to work out a little bit more on the transparency and what we can do to influence that. And so that's all just come together, and it really, when you're sitting in a market where most of your investments are going to be offshore, and in America, this becomes really relevant.
Okay. Christina, did you want to jump in? No, you're just hanging off. I love that you're hanging off mute, and then I shouldn't call you out.
Can I pivot back to like the private markets really quick, Joy, and like these process metrics? Because I think, like some of the questions that you're talking about, like what are the list of questions that you can give these managers or these movers of capital? And I keep going back and like reflecting on like how that dynamic has changed so much. And this goes back again, Mindy, to the notion of like who has the power, who's influencing, and how are we changing this? Because I think about, like we would push money into community loans or community development finance institutions, and we would be willing to do that because they're disseminating the money through in community, and they have, with great metrics, and they would reflect on who their lending community was and things like that. But then when you start digging in and you start talking to some of them, you realize that like these loans that they're extending are actually collateralized based off of the only assets, like the minimal assets that they actually have. And they're like 13 to 17% loans. But you know what? That's the only capital these folks are going to get. So gosh darn it, they should just be glad to have it. And then you go back and you start dialing it in as an investor, and you realize that, and you're like, well, wait, that's not what I wanted to have happen. I don't want somebody's car repossessed like that. No, that's not, So then we start asking more questions, and we start influencing the way that they're actually doing their lending, or else we're not going to send that capital to them, but we want to instead work with them and collaborate on how best to do that. And again, that's all just from kind of creatively working with the members of community to really understand what the end outcome was, and then repack it back into like how you're developing the capital at the beginning. And I'm just thinking there's so many of those questions, right? Like infrastructure investments, and you learn to like make sure that they have a policy around tribal communities at the very beginning of the conversation, and how those people are being influenced and held in conversation before an investment happens. Like all of those kinds of things, like if we could just figure out what all those questions are and push it out to like the broader like investor due diligence community, saying like, hey, go back and reflect on your process and like push these into that conversation as to how you're directing impact capital, right? Don't collateralize things, like, like make sure that there's extended services and like support around technical assistance and things like that to who you're lending to. I don't know, my mind's kind of spinning around like that list of questions right now. So I'm vomiting a little bit, and I get excited and I talk really fast.
Yeah, I think that the question issue is really curious, and I think the due diligence guide created by Criterion, all very
Yeah,
you know,
replicated by you. It's going to come out next week. I think it's almost done in the final stages. They took our due diligence guide for gender-based violence and adapted it to Australia. So we now have 3 due diligence.
I think that's really it's great. But then I go to, and I guess Teresa, you go to, well then, how do we make it more specific? It's like on the one end of there, and we need to, and hence we need to be constantly engaged in our role as translators with experts like you, Mindy. And then on the other hand, you're going, well, actually, I'm never going to get actually near anybody to ask a question. So what do I do? So then I've got my process metrics, which are really important. And then I've got my ability to exercise power. I'm not sure how that's going to work out through proxy voting. So that's how it's sort of like going through my brain. And for a private investor, there are these different options. Sometimes the power is not going to be able to be used everywhere at the same time. So, yeah.
So I think and maybe this is just getting some of the things we've been figuring out recently clearer in my head, but what the due diligence guide, when we started having a series of conversations with investors about that, I think you were on one of those calls, but their basic feedback was, we need indicators behind all these questions. What's the answer to these questions that we can be tracking in terms of rates? And so there was, what are the indicators that we can be tracking, but then what are the process metrics that we should be watching to see whether or not they're going to make good decisions? And so I think about right now, as I was thinking about this, it's like, well, what are those process metrics? And then I realized we've recently really been obviously digging into infrastructure. And what we're going to be working on for the next year is, what are the process metrics in infrastructure and what are the indicators in infrastructure by specific types? And then we can actually take those two tangibly to DFIs and say, adopt these, right? But then you're at a specific audience who's taking up a specific action. And if we get a bunch of DFIs to sign on at the same time, voila. But I think the piece that I keep coming back to that grounds me is, whatever we're doing these things, we do need a level of specificity or they're too abstract, right? And that's where, I think that for me is all the way through Convergence been an ongoing, like, yes, this is really hard to do, to say, what are the 3 questions I should ask about gender-based violence? That is a meaningless question unless you're grounding it in a sector, in a type of asset. And so moving back to that level of specificity is where I think we'll get to clear action. Nina.
Yeah, I really agree. I mean, as everyone's speaking, I'm thinking of examples that I've experienced, and they're incredibly regional and sector specific, right? Where, and one of the things that I think has come up that I want to say, I'm really re-saying the CDFI conversation was the most explicit about it, is that these questions need to be modified as we learn about the impact. I think it's really important not to put a series of questions out there and metrics out there without understanding that when we start getting more feedback, there may be impacts that were unexpected and that we need to modify the implementation, or will be shot down. Someone will say, well, you said this would work. And because it's not tested, we don't know that. And I'm thinking clearly of specific examples like the CDFI one, where it happened, where there was an outcome that was unexpected, as everyone keeps bringing up here. So that's of the many things running through my head, the one that I wanted to raise, that a couple of you have raised and restated. And I hope I was clear, because I'm definitely—
No, it was crystal clear, at least for me, that was crystal clear. And I think there's something in the CDFI example of, and we've just been writing a piece this last week about so many CDFIs were actually created by churches. And so one of the things we're calling churches to do in the midst of Black Lives Matter and the response to COVID is to say, you built some of these institutions that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And you built them, and then you walked away because you said, problem solved. But then you stopped watching them, and they've still got your name on them, and you still started them, and you should go back and figure something out, because you didn't just outsource social change and say, et voila. And there's a lot of places like that, right? Where good things got created. I think about microfinance as another area where good things got created for decent intent, some of it seriously misguided. But microfinance is an area where if people knew what in general was happening in microfinance tied to power dynamics around women's rights, it's a bit of a shit show. But we stopped asking those questions because microfinance is a solution that we all got very invested in. Yeah, I suppose we all got very invested in, and we can't blow it up because now it's working and it's scaled to this extent. But you're like, anyway. But it is by asset class, yeah.
A sector and an instrument and a region
Yes.
that has some really nasty gender-based violence outcomes that could be very targeted in this like feedback loop question.
Yeah.
Because the people here are already believers in some ways. So it's a friendly audience for a test, for a implementation of some further measurements on their processes. I don't know, throwing that out.
Yeah, it makes me wish Pro Mujer was here, because that's a lot of those conversations of sort of looking at what they've been trying to do in Latin America. You know them, right, Nina? Pro Mujer? Oh, you've run into them in your...
Yeah, I'm sure I do, yeah.
Really interesting thought, Nina, is that, yeah, if you have a tight audience around something like microfinance and like then all of a sudden just bringing to light some issue that they probably didn't realize that there were unintended consequences around. And then also offering them solutions on how they might better like advocate to those managers or those that are deploying the capital. I mean, it's as simple as like, I remember being in conversations years and years ago saying like, wait a second, like, so who bears the currency risk? The end borrower? Like, really? and like, it was just something that never even like came up, right? Like, oh, well, it's just the way it happens, And you're like, well, let's change that, right? So it's funny, like all these conversations keep coming full circle, but like, those that have the investment that can actually direct them that power towards like reshaping at that moment, like I guess going all the way back to your first question, Joy, is like maybe it goes all the way back to like the moment of deployment. When you're in the due diligence phase and you're going through and evaluating, like learn from community, bring that into your conversation and talk about all of the consequences all the way through, and then the capital doesn't flow unless it's under these particular terms.
I also, idea just sparked for me of it's in the deployment and the first due diligence, and I'm seeing some people do some very powerful things in their reinvestment. So we work with a German philanthropy that said to Women's World Banking, we'd like you to have a non-binary understanding of gender in your definition. Okay, them saying, we were game to have this be, okay, the first round, second round, we'd like you to look at this. And so remarkably, they are. So in some ways, it's also that, Teresa, I think about global partnerships and DFC's relationship with global partnerships, like they weren't a gender investment the first time round, but DFC in getting to its second investment actually started asking a bunch of questions and forcing global partnerships to be more explicit. You might have a different side of this story. I was sitting with DFC on this one, but they were sort of pushing to say, we're invested with you, we know enough about you, and we want to raise these questions a little bit higher, right? So Nina, some of the stuff you did with Root Capital of just like digging up, like when you're inside, you're often the best investor to be able to say with credibility, for me to keep my capital here, I need to see some changes.
I just want to add to that the side that like DFC was also evolving their strategy and going deeper as that engagement was taking place. So like you start somewhere as you're learning, as you're understanding your power, and keep using it.
Joy, I just wanted to go back to your one of the original concepts around how do you know if you've used all your power. I think we think about that and we think about at the same time, what are you actually asking for? Because a lot of the time our conversations end up in what, you know, we need to know what to ask for. So sometimes, I mean, it could be thought that when you're talking with a private investor, they need to also understand what power is available to them. So if the power that's available to them, if they're invested in public equities or what have you, maybe the power that they have to use and the extent of their power is the questions. And that's important for them to understand, because otherwise they will actually feel the opposite, which is disempowered, like why can't I be changing more? So I think that's an interesting aspect of a conversation. And at the other end, I want to say that I still feel that when we throw out the line, knowing what we want to ask, sometimes I feel that, and this is a safe spot, it's like an endless question. So when you have questions that can't be answered, they're also disempowering.
Right.
So sometimes I feel that question needs to have some boundaries around it. Does that make sense?
And this is where, I don't know, when I was putting this PowerPoint together the other day, I was really thinking it's both, I've been sitting here processing all this thinking for a while. It's the questions and then how you demand the answers. Because it can't just be about asking the questions. It needs to be about what are the mechanisms that allow you to demand answers. Because you can ask them till the cows come home.
So do you have some examples to throw in for me? Because I just haven't quite got it.
In terms of, so I mean, I'll say just taking not related to gender-based violence.
Part of it, so the how you demand the answers.
Well, so just to go back to this German example again, right? It was, I can ask the questions for a while, raise that I am concerned that there's a very binary understanding of gender, that I'd be interested in doing more. And now is the moment where our investment is being re-upped and I can keep my money with you or not. And so now's my moment to demand an answer to the question I've been asking you. Right, and those are just sort of, sometimes it's asking for a period of time and then saying, if I don't get an answer by a certain date, or they'll say, well, you know, the classic thing of, have you looked at gender-based violence? Well, no, I haven't, because there's nothing to look at in gender-based violence. The question of how much money have you spent, and can you break down the fees, because you're entitled to ask those questions, right? Can you break down how my fees are being spent in such a way to make sure that I'm getting the answers to the questions that I want, right? And if not, I will spend my money to get the answers someplace else, hand them to you and say, here's an answer, why didn't you deal with it? Some of it is just how do we, but I think this comes back again to Nina's point, you can only do that in a crowd in a very specific context where you know that your answers, and this is, I think, the piece that that in general around gender-based violence, we're getting more examples of, where you know that in the end it actually does matter, right? I think when we first started this 3 years ago, we didn't know what really mattered. We just know that nobody was asking questions. And I think we're getting closer and closer to say, this is worth pushing for answers on. And so let's collectively use our power to get there.
Can I say one thing? Like, I appreciate what Julia said earlier around like an open-ended question. I just think about like an open-ended question and you get like a soft answer on an RFP, right? Like, how are you mobilizing for gender-based violence? And you're going to get some kind of like, I don't know. I do like the more succinct answer where like, what are you doing? How have you moved money? I guess I want to pivot it a little bit though and make that, I would love that dynamic to be softer and more collaborative. And in that I feel like I'm only where I'm at in this journey and in doing this work because of the fact that I have clients who are willing to give me a moment to learn and be in this journey with them, and then keep activating, keep moving it forward. And it's a dance that we're doing together. So I think that if there was a way to pivot that question to say like, I really want to do this, I'm willing to, you know, help you like source resources and give you this question of due diligence. Would you be willing to implement it? And also, like, if you have, you know, what is the resource budget around due diligence, and can some of that be pivoted in alignment with this, right? I don't know. I obviously, like, I'm biased because I'm sitting on the side of the table where I really want to be of help, and I don't want somebody like accusing me of not doing something. And it's just such a more constructive conversation if we can work in collaboration, but maybe that's just not the experience a lot of people are having with their advisors, and I get that too.
And the
But again, this is back to the packaging idea, right? Oh, sorry, Christina.
No, I just said the truth is nobody knows how to do this because nobody has done it before. So yeah, having that grace of where we're all coming from, trying to figure it out together is important.
Full stop. Like, yes. And I think we all need to keep remembering that. I will say though, I did just get a request today for a referral to an advisor, Teresa, and I gave your name as like, this person's on a great journey. Great journey. Go ahead, Teresa.
Thank you, Joy.
I know this is goes back to a much earlier conversation, Joy, and we're almost out of time. But Mindy, you asked, we're talking earlier about turning money down, and our executive director is really good and brave and about calling back someone after a conversation and saying, it made me really uncomfortable that she will call out, like if we're on a call with a grantee or an investment person or anyone, and the man is the person who speaks the entire time. Or we've also had situations where the white person speaks all the time and none of the people of color speak. And she will circle back like unhesitantly. And instead of just saying no, or we won't fund you, although sometimes we don't, often we don't, but she'll give them that feedback. And I was just wanted to make sure that I circled back with you and said, instead of just saying no, are you comfortable? Do you feel empowered enough just to say quietly as an influencer, I'm uncomfortable when I'm talking about gender and none of the women on the call are speaking up. It feels like I'm not living my values in that moment. And I just wanted to share that with you. I'm some version of that. Anyway.
I love that, Nina. That's awesome that that's happening. I think we need more and more of that. You know, it's really tricky. I'm perceived as like all of us probably are. We're perceived as complicated women, right? We're working on complicated topics, right? I've dedicated my life to complication. So then I can easily, I've been torn down when I have stood up, right? And especially because I work on this issue, right? So it's like the more I can have others like you helping me say those things, the better off we're all going to be, right? Because it is so easy for that investor or whatever to say, oh, you're just complicated, forget this, right? Or this issue is already complicated, I'm not going to deal with you because you're a complicated being. Well, yes, I am, and this is complicated, but could we get somewhere together? Yes, we could, right? If we're, but anyway, I really appreciate that, Nina. Thank you.
I'm channeling Han Lee, so I'll tell her that.
I love it.
Well, and just coming back to the sort of, what can we do to help each other? And I was just having a flashback to, I got shut down on a panel that I was actually now it's just ridiculously shut down 2 days ago by a guy who told me I was too complicated, literally publicly. And
we're going to need this person's name and phone number, Joy.
He's been taken care of. I think part of the question is, in those moments, what I'm really resonating with is, how do we know that we're aligned with a bunch of other people fighting the same power dynamics, right? At a very simple level, I know the panel pledge is silly, but like it was important and everybody started asking and demanding the same thing. And so if we can start putting out a set of these process metrics that say there is an underlying power dynamic when this happens in finance, and there's a set of us who are going to start calling it out. And so we've been looking at, I mean, that's part of what this document is about, of what we saw in both in a set of communities in Canada and in board depth that we saw in terms of how investors were treating their underlying, the companies in the Pacific, and just said, these are power dynamics about whose knowledge matters, right? And at some fundamental level, if investors only think that investors' knowledge matters and the community's knowledge never matters, it's not just bad power dynamics, it's bad business. Like, it means you're not getting information about what's actually happening in the community. And can we say the housing crisis of 2008, right? So the part of the question is, how do we start really isolating in on what are the questions? We need to get these questions answered. We're all demanding this together. And so when you're in this room saying, well, I'm only asking this because Nina has asked me to ask you this question. There's a friend of mine who's a significant philanthropist, and she's been pushing blah, blah, blah. And so I'm really just asking because as a favor to her, I thought I'd bring this up, and she wanted to know what your answer was. Like, how do we borrow each other's power in doing this so we're not feeling like we're holding all of this individually? Final thoughts? Maybe we could take that, let's not hold this individually and go off and do things collectively.
Look, all I can say is that I feel like I'm pushing the proverbial uphill in asking what I'm asking for at the moment. And I've co-opted everybody's power, including the power of the government, in saying that this is government policy. So guys, as it is, this is what we need to pay attention to. But to this point, Joy, I don't think the power of Criterion can be underestimated, because knowing that there is a community doing exactly the same thing, asking the same questions, and what are those questions? So if we go back to basics, the questions are not coming out of thin air. They're grounded in, as you said, the community and the information that has been provided through experts through the years. And I point to your power, and I also point to the power of money that's already been invested in North America and in Europe, and of course in developing countries. So that's what I point to, and I can only tell people how I go at the end of the story, which will probably be in about 18 months. But anyway, I'll keep going.
No, and I think I point to you and Vicky pretty often about sort of, here are these magical women putting all of their effort towards this. So with that, this has been a really helpful conversation I'll say personally, this has been incredibly helpful to put some pieces together. So I'm just I'm being selfish in this and say this was great for me. So I'm hoping it also worked for you. And one more conversation tomorrow morning, and then the conversations are done.
And I just want to, Joy, I think this is so powerful, because I think this is actually something that it's almost like if I have your blessing, all of you on the phone, the next moment I'm in that conversation, that is you are shifting your power to me, when I can honestly throw out your names and say, you know what, these women are trying to do this. You must have heard of them. Or, I mean, I think that's really part of it, right? Because it's like the old boys network, right? Like, we need to create our own network and way of doing this, right? And it's our sisterhood. And I think there's a lot of ways we could really use it. Sorry, I was just really like, oh, yes.
No, I learned a long time ago, the only reason one has any power is to let other people borrow it. That is the only point. Otherwise, it's a bit of a pain in the ass sometimes. and took too much to get. So by all means, Mendy, feel free to invoke Criterion wherever you want. It's why we exist. So anyway, and Nina as a board member is giving full endorsement to use our brand whenever. So, all right. Well, with this, we will thank you for this conversation, and we'll keep this going. There's a lot from this to follow up on. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. This is great.
All right. Be well.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.